Welcome to Your 18 Now What? Thank you for joining me on this great Tuesday. I'm Dr. Catherine Gilstein, and I am looking forward to empowering you with information about financial literacy and economic empowerment. I will be posting new episodes every second and fourth Tuesday of the month. And today I would like to welcome a special guest, and his name is Joshua Lee. He is the current CEO and co founder at Tribe Money Pools, an upcoming startup that is innovating how groups share and manage their finances. Before this, Joshua worked as Dell as product manager that helped develop product with a focus on consumer finances and identity protection. He graduated from the University of Washington in 2022 with a bachelor's degree in mathematics, and since then has had a passion in bringing financial solutions to underserved communities in today's financial ecosystem. So he's a lot like me in spreading the word on financial literacy, especially for the younger generation and helping. So, Joshua, welcome and thank you so much for joining me.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me today.
We're going to go through a couple of things. I'd really like to know more about you and your platform and what you're doing. But we're going to start with what is group finances and why is it so important to manage?
Yeah, absolutely. So group finance is where different peers come together to manage their finances together, whether it's to go out for an event or splitting some meal, just any act of actually managing the transactions that occur within a different group. And this really comes down to four main components when it comes to the actual management itself. We've identified and seen it as communication, being able to properly talk about, what sort of finances you are trying to do, whether it's pulling money together to budget, or whether it's having somebody front something and then afterwards splitting the expenses. Just communication is one big part. The next part is the actual facilitation. How do people typically collect payments? How are they going to use the payments? And then of course the execution itself as well, the actual usage of the funds that are either collected or afterwards split. And then, of course, governance. How are people managing and using the finances together, and who is allowed to spend the money that's pulled together? And that's really how group finances work today, as a general term. Whether it's done through applications or done through different channels, people typically manage their finances through these different or use these different practices when managing their finance. And it's so important today because as we are very communal as people, we tend to have group finances in our day-to-day lives with the people around us. And groups is a very broad and generic term, but it can really be anything more than just yourself. And it's the management of finances that doesn't just pertain to yourself, but also the ones that you share with those around you.
Okay, that kind of makes sense. I mean, studies do show that people do tend to spend more when they're with a group than when they are alone. So that could um, that could be a part of it as well. How do group finances affect our personal lives, and what impact can it have on our well-being? And I have done a podcast on money and mindfulness, so I'm really intrigued to see your thoughts on this, to hear them.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one thing that people don't realize is that there's a lot of connections between our personal finances as well as our group finances, and more specifically, how people are situated in their lives with how much finances that they have and how it relates to the groups that they're a part of. As an example, with friend groups, you'll have some friends who are more financially well off and those who aren't as financially well off, and this can affect the dynamic of the relationship, depending on
Absolutely.
which side of that coin you sit on. Really, when you think about it, if you're a friend who is a lot less financially well off, you typically might be a person that often gets covered for, or someone who can't go out and hang out with your friends because you can't financially support going out to those activities, and it often puts a strain on our relationships, and that could reflect in more than just friend groups. We've seen it oftentimes in families, in friend groups, and relationships. And I think it's one of those things where people actually don't understand that how people manage their finances with their groups also can directly affect the nature and the health of those groups as well. Um, and the biggest thing that really comes down to it is that people don't always like to communicate about their finances with their
Hmm.
peers and their groups because it's a difficult thing to do. We've found that our finances are stuff that we keep very close to ourselves, especially when you're not as financially well off. And as a result of that, we can actually see strains that occur in a lot of different relationships due to this financial difference in their standings typically. And it definitely does have a long-term effect outside of just the relationship itself. It can also affect how people are living their day-to-day lives because of the byproduct of how people's management of their finances with their friend groups or their other peers really does have the opportunity to negatively impact them if it's not really well managed.
Oh, absolutely. And I think finances start at a very young age because it's all a matter of, your culture, where you grew up, who you grew up with, what you were surrounded by. So all of those things play a role and keep in the back of your mind even when you're not even thinking about it. So, fast forward to when you're 25 and you're going to get something and you can like hear your parent in the background saying, "Well, is that a need or is that a want?" And you're like, well, wait a second, where did that just come from?
Right.
And you just kind of think about that. But the group thing is important. Why? What are things people can learn about financial literacy through group financial management?
So I think one thing that people can definitely learn about financial literacy through at least group financial management is how to manage your personal finances well enough to be able to go out and, do what events you might need to do with groups, and also within group financial management, how to actually keep a well budgeted system and how you spend and track your finances. With groups, oftentimes what people typically do is, just if it's people that you're very close with, people typically just manage it more ad hoc, just, with the people around them with because there's a lot of trust. But with more larger groups and larger organizations, the financial management actually has to be very tight with very like, good bookkeeping as well as ledgers to make sure you can actually track all the finances and ensure
Mhm.
that it's very important to keep track of all your spending and making sure that you keep a close eye on the inflows and outflows. And it's something that we have to think about our own personal finances, and there's a direct correlation between how groups do it and how we should learn to actually manage our finances ourselves. And if one or the other is severely lacking, there tends to be a lot of negative impact down the line in how we manage our finances also personally, because we are affected by the people around us, and that typically make that connection can fall into our personal finances as well.
Absolutely. What I find is that now in the digital age that we have, we went from, balancing the checkbook to keeping control of our finances to getting a debit card and just being able to swipe it wherever and not knowing what we're spending to now where you just take your phone and just tap it. Like you don't even need your card anymore. Your card is in your wallet on your phone. You just tap it at the store. It goes, tap, tap, tap. And before you know it, you went out and you got nothing and spent $150 that day and you're like, whoa, what happened here? So I think tracking finances is getting harder. So even though we have all of this technology and all of this digital stuff available for us, tracking what we're spending is getting more difficult, especially for the younger generation, because they could just swipe the card or just tap the phone. So what are your thoughts on managing that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it really plays the same way that I, mentioned earlier, right? When you go out with groups, it's become so hard to track your finances. Oftentimes, a lot of things slip through the crack, whether you have somebody front something and then never ask for reimbursements, right? Just at least from a group's perspective, it's very easy to lose track of finances. And especially with how much easier it is to lose track with how quickly we can access our funds, right? Like you mentioned, you can tap pay so
Hmm.
easily, and
Yep.
you know you don't even think, a lot of people don't even think to check their bank accounts to see everything that they spend on their finances on. And I think the thing is, because it's so easy to miss this information, which is the most critical part in managing your finances, really just tracking it at the end of the day. It really
Mhm.
shows you where the discrepancies lie and where you need to better save or better spend. And with understanding that groups have the same issue, if you can really put that practice into your own personal life as well, you see that direct translation and making sure that you keep track of your spending on the day to day, and just also know how to plan for the future as well, which is incredibly important with these, especially with the younger generation. We tend to think about the day and now and not really think about the future when it comes to our spendings. And even with groups, you see the same thing. um, and I definitely do think that these days it's become much more difficult to track finances, to your point.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't change how important it is, because at the end of the day, I apologize, uh, transparency is the key that
Mm-hmm.
makes group finances, become as efficient as possible. And that also translates over to your own personal finances as well at the end of the day.
I find that in the group setting, like if we're going out with a group of friends of ours, it always seems to be that whoever assumes, the assumption of who makes the most money is getting the bill and they're going to cover it. And then everybody else will just, okay, well, I'll just send you my $40 or my $55 or whatever it is that I owe you, which is great because the bill's taken care of and then that happens. But then I find that if I'm the one that's fronting the bill and I'm supposed to get funds from other people, I'll get I'll get the money from other people, but there's always that one person that just holds out and
Right.
doesn't pay you back. And I think as a person, and then I feel bad, about asking for it, like, do
Right.
I request funds from them through Zelle? Do I request it from Venmo? Like, what's easier for them? Can they not have it? And then, so I think that also puts a little pressure on the group dynamic as well, because then you're seeing like, well, is it that same person over and over who's struggling, and then you don't want to leave them out, but maybe they're not in, that financial security space that you are. So,
Right.
navigating that.
I know, absolutely. And that's actually to the point that we were talking about earlier, right? How group finances could eventually affect your personal lives as well. I think one thing that people don't talk about very often is how emotionally charged discussing finances is with your peers, right? Because again, when you're thinking about finances personally, you can be upset if your finances are great or really happy if they are, but at least it's all kept within yourself, and so it's very easy to manage those emotions as opposed to when you, right, just with the example you gave me, if you're going out with friends, getting food often, if you're the person who has to request somebody to pay you back frequently, that also feels pretty awkward. It's a difficult conversation to have, as opposed to on the
Mhm.
flip side being the person who can't actually, say maybe your financial situation isn't well off, you still want to be part of your friends and hang out and get these experiences, but as a byproduct you end up not being able to pay for everything. There's actually very often instances where people will actually pull funds in other means and start putting themselves in debt just to avoid that
Correct.
awkward conversation. And because of that emotionally charged element to it, people tend to be very avoidant in having these conversations at the end of the day, which can lead to a lot of downstream effects, that affect our personal lives, whether you're going into debt or you lose your friends, right? And I
Mhm.
think that that's one thing that people don't really talk about in general, and that's why it's so important to be, transparent, as well as also just discussing your finances and being open to discuss it with the people that are close to us, at least those that need to understand the
Absolutely.
situation.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you, and I think it comes down to, like you said, to have that transparency, but you also be able to have that vulnerability to be able to share with your friends and say, hey, I love hanging out with you, and things are going really well, and I'm so happy where you are in your career, but I'm not quite there yet. So maybe could we do, instead of going out to eat, can we just like all come to pick one person's house and like eat in, everybody bring a dish, and try to find different ways to make that person feel inclusive without letting them break the bank, because you don't want to see your friends struggle either. So
Right.
that's always disheartening, and you don't want to, I mean, I can say, no problem, Joshua, don't worry about it, I'll get your dinner today, and you'll be like, okay, fine. And if I do that once or twice, that's okay, but the third time I do that, then you're going to start feeling bad. And I don't
Right.
want to put you in that position. So I think that's definitely a conversation to have. And I think a lot of people are afraid to have that conversation. They don't want to say or own up to, hey, you know what? I'd love to go out with you. I just can't do it this week. And that
Right.
should be okay and accepted. And I think that's where the conversations really need to get real between friends.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, in the younger generation, including myself, it's been one of those things, discussing finances with others, at least when it comes down to, if you're not as financially well off, I think it's a very difficult challenge. I think a lot of us have become avoidant to these conversations, mostly just due to the fact that, growing up, it wasn't something that we discussed with our peers. It's not something that you're comfortable. You haven't worked those muscles yet, right? To really understand how to
Oh,
discuss even your
absolutely.
finances. As you get older, you have a partner in life, it becomes a bit more of a natural um natural topic to discuss, and then it becomes easier to
Hmm.
have these conversations, especially as you get older and older. And your financial standings, yes, they're always important, but when we're younger, we think that there's a much larger emphasis in our social standings due to our financial standings. And because of that, if you're not on the upper echelon, or if you're not doing as financially well off, or you're not the one who's making the most, sometimes it does become very difficult to hold those conversations, especially if you're the ones who are probably on the lower end of being financially well
Hmm.
off. And so,
Absolutely. Well, I
yes,
mean, just okay, I'm gonna just use you and I as an example too here. We're obviously two different generations. Okay.
right.
I'm much older. How often did you hear your family when you were growing up talk about finances? Because when
I
I was a child, never, never. And I remember asking the question and saying, "Hey mom, how much is this?" Nope, not your worry. Your worry is to go to school and get good grades. Like that is your job. My job is to take care of everything. So it was never even spoken about in the household. And I don't think that's changed over the years. And I think parents having conversations with their kids about their finances when they get their first job. Okay, you got your first job. Well, this is how much money you make. Well, let's put away half and spend half, and like start those habits early on when they're 14, 15, 16, just starting out and work. And remembering to put away money first, pay yourself first, and then whatever you have left over, buy whatever you want, splurge, have the latte, buy the $100 jeans, whatever the case may be.
Right, absolutely. And I have to say, even with the generational difference, nothing has changed on that regard, as
Nothing
far
has
as I
changed.
understand it. Unless
Exactly.
some
It's
of my friends,
terrible.
they have parents who are accountants, who sort of force this conversation a lot earlier on. But I think in your typical American household, it's not a discussion that occurs very naturally, or very frequently for that matter as well. And because of that, especially with how much harder it's become to even manage your finances today, there's so many more tools, but the space feels so much more complicated than it may have been. Obviously you probably understand this a little bit more better than I do. But from my understanding, it's been
Hmm.
because people are now overburdened by choice, and there's so much out there. It's really hard
Too
for us
many
to get our
options.
foot in the door. Exactly. And it feels very overwhelming and overbearing. It's
Too
even
many.
harder for us to even start that conversation, even know where to begin ultimately. But I think that, yes, that there's been no change, at least as from the
No change.
generations, no change on
No,
that end.
no change. And I mean that was my whole reason for doing what I do, and probably one of your reasons for doing what you do, is that if you are born into a middle class or upper middle class family and you have that set up for you, you're going to get some of that information. But if you're growing up in the inner city and second generation immigrant, like where are you getting that information from? How are you understanding the US credit system? How are you getting to know that? And even just basics of the difference between a debit card and a credit card. Like why do I need a credit card? What's it going to do for me? What's going to be the advantage of it? And I think those conversations are harder for the inner city. And I shared with you earlier, I grew up in New York City. I grew up in Brooklyn, and not there. I teach in Philadelphia. The information's not there. You look at Miami, Detroit, Chicago, all of these inner city groups of places, and the financial literacy information is just not available to them. So you can't play the game if you don't know the rules of the game, and even where to start. And I think that's what makes it a little bit more challenging. Um, Looking at groups as a general term, but more specifically, um, what are they, and what does financial management look like for these specified areas for you and what you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So for, just I think groups is a very broad term. It's at least something that, I wanted to talk more about just because, we're building a solution that's going to help groups share and manage their finances ultimately. But really, when we say groups, I was referencing anything more than just one person. So,
Mhm.
it could be, just you and another person, like you and your best friend or a friend group. It could be a relationship. It can even be roommates. And even something as small, something more intimate, like a family, right? Parents who are managing their finances with their kids, you can consider that a group, as well as larger organizations. So now you get to college clubs, hobby and interest groups, anything of the sort that, is a much larger spectrum as well. Um, but financial management is very different depending on what you see for these different groups, right? And so, for us, what we like to think as our intimate groups, people that we trust, right? Our finances look very different than when we are, working our finances with, for instance, like an HOA or like a club where you don't really know the people around you, don't really trust them yet because you haven't built that relationship yet. And so how we manage our finances becomes very, very different between those two different niches. Um, we're really talking about, families earlier that we were mentioning, right, with friend groups, because there's that inherent trust there, people are able to, and they're given the ability to, be a lot more relaxed about their financial management, at least from that constraint, and or from that extent. And then from the other side, with the more larger groups, you typically find that things have to be kept much tighter. And so the financial management becomes much more stringent, and it becomes very important to be able to, track, communicate, facilitate, and execute, and really at the end of the day now govern those finances. And really that big word comes to how you govern those finances, which ultimately leads to the management, because with people who you trust, the governance doesn't need to really exist. Everyone already sort of knows each other, and it's difficult for somebody to cause perhaps financial infidelity, take finances and leave, although it does occur, still within those more intimate settings. But even with the larger groups, right, when you don't know the people around you, it becomes so important to learn how to govern those finances ultimately, because that's how you make sure that not only are your finances safe and your group's finances safe as well, but ultimately, therefore, you also just better understand, how it is to make sure that the finances are properly spent and used as well, ultimately.
Yeah, I know that group finances can be difficult, especially when you're talking about, organizations and HOAs and things like that, and being on the board of these things and being able to watch that and manage that. So it does make it a little bit more difficult. Um, I'd really like you to talk about Tribe Money Pools and that platform that you're working on, because I think it's going to be so important.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we're building is, as I mentioned earlier, a means for how groups share and manage their finances. It really hits on all those 4 points we talked about earlier: the communication, the facilitation, execution, and governance. We really wanted to take all those segmented and fragmented parts of group financial management and just all put it in one place, where it'd be a lot easier to be able to track your expenses, to collect money, to split bills, and communicate about them, all in one place. For us, oftentimes these days, we have so many different tool sets that are so specified into different focuses, you that people use for financial management. For instance, people will track their finances on Excel, then communicate over iMessage, and then have to collect money on Venmo, check, cash, PayPal. And having all these different tools makes it
You
really hard to
see, making it
consolidate.
more difficult, a lot more, a lot more difficult. So we have all of these
Right.
available platforms, but it seems like it's making it more complicated. So you're going to streamline this,
Yes,
I'm hoping.
absolutely. Yes, yes. So that's really what we're hoping to do. What we wanted to at least start off with, with their application, was build something where people can at least learn how to budget or split expenses, so that, at least groups, what oftentimes occurs, especially with the more informalized groups, is that one person who, as we mentioned earlier, right, the person who likes to pay
Mhm.
more often because they're more financially well off, well, they're usually also
Absolutely.
not only the bookkeeper, but also the treasurer and the bank for these groups, even though it's very informally said. And with these more,
Mhm.
larger groups like hobby and interest groups, this also still comes the exact same way if they're not, incorporated, established enough to have a business or business banking account, right?
Mhm.
Usually have a single person that becomes this bank for these groups, and it becomes a very heavy burden for this person to keep, all the ledgers, really make sure they track all the finances, collect all the payments. It becomes a very difficult process. And so what we're really hoping to do is just at least provide a space where people can pool money together or split finances if that does occur. And outside of that, the main thing is the ability to track all the finances as a group and have shared accountability to, a group account that people have together where they've stored their finances. And that's really just at its core what the application is. And of course, we bring the additional tool sets to ensure transparency in all those financial moments, whether it's just through communication, or whether it's just trying to track the inflows and outflows, each member's contributions. That we just really want to bring light and transparency to all that so that groups can, get all their information about their finances very quickly, very easily, can have open conversations about them. And in turn, they can focus on what they want to do, as opposed to spending a lot of times with the headaches and the emotionally charged moments that come in group financial management.
I mean, I know from just doing group events and, setting up group events and setting up fundraisers and things like that, it can be a lot. And you have, not 2 or 3 people involved. You have a good 15, 18 people involved who are all volunteering their time to put all of this together. But we're getting stuff that's being donated, but then there are little things that come into effect where we are laying our money out of pocket for, and who's responsible for what portion of what we're putting together. So I think, in that aspect, it could be really great. I think just for like a general like group weekend, and it's very easy to save for the short term to go away for the weekend, but difficult to save for the long term. So we know that. But even just setting up, like just like a friend's weekend 3 months from now, we have, like 8, 10 people going. It's like, okay, well, what do we need? If we can put them all into that one group, like he said, for your application of where everybody can see everything and say, oh, okay, well, I got this, I got this, I got this, and make it a little bit more manageable. And then it does put the burden on everyone instead of just that one person. And I think that's the most important thing.
Right, absolutely. And also with, the burden being spread out, right? The due diligence also is now spread out as well. And it's a lot less prone to error, right? When you have multiple people taking a look at the same finances, it's a lot easier to budget for things in advance. I'm sure with, as in your example of working, events in the past, there maybe have been times where you guys might have gone over budget. Now you have to figure out who has to pay out of pocket. Do we have to expense this? And because people aren't tracking everything very in a consolidated manner, it gets very easy to let things slip through the cracks. But now that that's why you want to make sure that that responsibility is shared amongst everybody, and that eventually it results in much better financial management for the group. But those practices can be taken into our own personal lives as well.
Okay. So with Tribe Money Pools, when is everything going to launch, and when will we be able to see that?
Yeah, so we are currently in beta testing. So if people are interested in just, checking out what we're doing, they're more than welcome to stop by our website at tribe.money. Otherwise, if it comes to the new year, we are planning to launch in January. So we'll be in the App Store, Play Store by then. So you can download it on iOS, Android, all the different platforms. And hopefully, for all your different groups, it will help you, manage your finances much more transparently and much more securely as well.
Okay, that sounds amazing. So it's tribe.money. That's the website?
Correct. Yes.
Okay, so tribe.money. Make sure you have that. Make sure you check it out. And Joshua, thank you so much for joining me. For everyone else, thanks so much for joining my podcast. And I hope you like, listen, and share. So be open to learning, be open to listening, ask questions. What more do you want to know? Visit my website at your18nowwhat.com and drop me a line, send a question or a comment. And any questions received will be responded to by either email or addressed on the next podcast. Remember, be invaluable for what you share, not what you know. See you next time on Your 18 Now What. Be sure to visit my website. Thanks for joining me. I appreciate you.